Right, let's move on to our second manager then for today's podcast. We're dropping down a few divisions and we are going to League Two for a relegation battle. We've already talked about Mark Moseley leaving Southend. Well, Grimsby changed manager halfway through the campaign. Ian Holloway was sacked. If you'd like to go back and hear more about him, by the way, we have profiled him already on this podcast. But the man who replaced him was a returning manager at Blundell Park. That is Paul Hurst. And he's got one heck of a job on his hands, Mike. But he started pretty well, but I mean, his interview yesterday after the 1-0 defeat to Bradford, and we'll come on to what actually happened in that game if you don't know already very shortly. He, for the first time, I think, sounded like a little fed up, and it sounded like he just wants this season to be over so he can do a rebuild. And rebuilds are the theme of this week's podcast, but I get the sense he probably needs to get rid of about 80% of that squad.
He's inherited a bit of a mess, it seems, and I think there's been a lot of uncertainty at boardroom level all season long. And it's a club that needs a real shake-up. And I think Paul Hurst would be the ideal man. And it sounds like with the right backing, with the right sort of boardroom structure in place, and the right support, that he's willing to go down into non-league with Grimsby. And it's looking more and more that way now that that's what's going to happen. It's kind of come full circle. And, we've just spoken about David Moyes, and, Paul Hurst is kind of on the same journey now, because he brought, he had this big body of work with Grimsby, brought them out of non-league into the league, then left to take bigger and, better opportunities further up the divisions, had a little bit of success with Shrewsbury, but very close to getting into the Championship with Shrewsbury. But then he took the Ipswich job and it's all kind of gone backwards and downhill for him since there. So now he finds himself back where he started. But I think he just longs for a long-term position and a job that he can really get his teeth into right from the beginning, rebuild from scratch and build a club up from the bottom in his own image. And he'll certainly get that opportunity with Grimsby, because you can't imagine they've got anything better down, on the table if you go down into non-league now than Paul Hurst willing to stay and do the job he's done before.
Yeah, we talked about Phil Brown, didn't we, at the top of the show, and we said that he'd probably be off. You said into the sunsets. He certainly won't need the tan from that if he leaves them. If Southend go down, but Paul Hurst kind of feels the opposite to me. He kind of feels like the man who's going to relish the challenge, roll up his sleeves, dig in, and say, right, I'll be the man to get you out of non-league and straight back into League Two.
Yeah, I think he's a very dutiful manager. I think he does it. He's not in it for himself. He's not all about himself, which might surprise people, certainly Shrewsbury fans, the fact that the manner in which he left Shrewsbury. I think it was mostly, he has left a couple of jobs now for better jobs. But I think he is the sort of manager that left to get on with the job his own way. We see the best of Paul Hurst when allowed to do the job his own way. And as long as he's allowed to be as outspoken as he wants to be, because he likes to be brutally honest sometimes and say things that people don't like to hear. And as long as people accept him for what he is and allow him to do the job in his own way, and sometimes be a little bit belligerent and a little bit, he's even spoken himself about, I've got, a little bit of the small man syndrome, the fact that he was 5'7" and he had to, sort of stand up to a lot of bigger players on the pitch. And, that's kind of, he's got this fiery temper about him. I think as long as he has accepted for the type of manager who he is, then I think this is just what he wants. Is he just wants to be able to do a job on his own terms for the long term and rebuild a club sensibly. And I think he's kind of at a position where he's got no choice now, because possibly out of character, he has been tempted away by a couple of bigger jobs. And he might potentially even regret that a little bit himself now, because of the fact that he's ended up back in this position, back in non-league football, as it would appear to be.
And is consistency a real plus for him then? Because that Shrewsbury side, and I remember that campaign well, actually. I really enjoyed Shrewsbury's journey, as you say, onto the brink of the Championship. Sadly didn't make it, but went ever so close and completely defied the odds as well. Real underdog story. But one thing from seeing several Shrewsbury games that season was the way that they largely kept the same squad. He had a small squad, but they largely kept the same 11. They rarely deviated from the style of play that was preferable. And just by doing things in the same way, they got results. And even when it felt like they'd been sussed out in the middle of the campaign, they had a little wobble, and everyone was like, "Oh, I think teams are cottoning on to them." They kind of persisted with what they were doing and battled through it and came out the other side. It clearly feels to me like Paul Hurst wants consistency as part of his routine.
Yeah, it was an extraordinary season. And I mean, you can see some parallels in what he's tried to do at Grimsby since he's gone in. I think he starts with clean sheets. I think he starts with basics, and he starts with, not giving away anything for cheap freebies. It's about, this not, we'll talk about it, the small man syndrome and the standing your ground against anybody. That's his starting point for anything is, you measure up to your direct opponent and you give nothing away for free, and there's no quarter given. And I think that was the basis for that extraordinary Shrewsbury campaign. I think also though as well, I mean, it should be pointed out the recruitment was extraordinary in terms of the loan market, especially. I mean, to get Dean Henderson as your goalkeeper, Ben Godfrey as your defensive midfielder, Carlton Morris as your centre forward. I mean, these are not your average loan signings to get in one window. So that was obviously a big part of it. But yeah, it was all built on a solid foundation of, a team structure and a setup that made sure, you've got bits of quality like that within your team, and you've got the basis of an overall structure that's greater than the sum of its parts that doesn't give things away for cheap. Then, you're on a really solid footing to move forward. And yeah, I think, it's not going to work for Grimsby now. It wouldn't appear, but there's been a move, they've really struggled for goals, but there's been a move towards clean sheets or very tight defensive, XG numbers in recent weeks. And I think he's just going to run out of time in this job. But yeah, that Shrewsbury template is the body of work that he will always look to recreate, I think.
I know it's probably going to be a dagger to your heart, Mike, to mention this because you did back them, but they were very, very unlucky in that game against Salford a couple of weeks ago. They're in games, aren't they? They're really, really tight, and they are, as you say, giving away very little, if anything, in some matches as well. And the numbers have proved that. We can't really go on without mentioning what's happened this weekend. There was an incident against Bradford in which Stefan Payne, who has a reputation for being a little bit irascible, headbutted teammate Philip Moresh. And Paul Hurst was obviously asked about this. He's often, Mike, a man who, we should mention, by the way, Payne was sent off. He's often a man who gives his opinions and isn't afraid, as you say, to say it how it is. And one thing I found curious was he was almost blaming both players in this interview. He was saying they're both as culpable as one another, but when pressed on whether they'd play for the club again, he wouldn't commit to anything.
Yeah, it's an interesting incident in the sense that, I guess, like we're saying, no quarter given and that aggression. I think aggression's a big thing he promotes. He just doesn't expect that aggression to be between two of his own players, but that's the potential risk you run when tensions are running high in the situation that Grimsby are in. I think there's a lot of integrity to Hurst, and he expects the same level of integrity amongst his own players. And when he asks them to be aggressive and go onto the pitch with this mindset and possibly fires them up and overfires them up, he just doesn't expect them to turn on each other. And that's what's happened. And, in his world, he would never turn on one of his own players in that manner. But you suspect he's possibly getting these players fired up so much that that's the way it's manifested. And he's just not understood those two personalities necessarily. And that was, these are the things that could come of it. So it's interesting in that sense because it kind of gives you, I think back to, say, for example, was at the Neil Harris podcast, and we talked about players coming to blows on the pitch under Cardiff, and that was the very beginning because he was trying to foster a culture, a masculine culture, and playing players off against each other a little bit. I don't think that's what Hurst was doing, but I think in trying to generate this aggression in his players and this no quarter given, you win your individual battles. If a player's simmering and got that kind of emotions running around inside of them, and then two of them clash over a misplaced pass, that's kind of what's manifested, which is not to say it's Hurst's fault. It's definitely the two players. There's nobody should need to have it told to them that you're in a relegation battle. You go and headbutt one of your own players and get sent off in a game that's in the balance. And it's just, It's just ridiculous that something so silly could be so costly for Grimsby, because again, they were really in the game, and it sounded, even listening to Mark Truman, the Bradford manager turning around saying, that was a really tough game for us. It was even against 10 men. We're just glad to get that game over with and get the 3 points even better, because it was a really tough game. And I think Grimsby have stepped it up to the level that they needed to in recent weeks, but it's not going to be enough because of incidents like that, because of not putting the ball in the back of the net, at the top end of the pitch.
I'm asking you for a prediction here, Mike, but it's actually, I guess, more of a reflection. If Paul Hurst had been given this full season to manage Grimsby, where do you think they would be?
I think they would be out of trouble, because I think Hurst has got... We can make a comparison here with Mark Mosley, because I think we're talking about the same personality type, and not necessarily the same methods, but the same... We're looking for the same compound effects. It's a manager that you have to give them time when they first walk through the door. They're not going to get it right straight away. They're going to have to... it's incremental progress. It's steady progress, and you're looking for compound effects further down the line. Now, Hurst would have started the job at the beginning of the season with a lot more experience than Mosley. So I think we could expect Grimsby would have been out of trouble by now and would have been comfortable looking at another season in League Two. I think that's it, basically. And as for, if they do go down, then if they stick by Hurst, I think they're ready to attack non-league next season. But it's all going to depend about what's happening at boardroom level. And, the decisions, is he going to get the support? Is he going to be able to turn over the squad, and rebuild in the way he wants to? And if so, then, we're basically rewinding the clock 5 years or so back to when Grimsby were a force at non-league level looking to get back with Hurst in charge.
He hasn't really been given time, to deal in transfers. If he is given time over the summer, if the takeover happens and he's given carte blanche to sign who he wants for maybe a League Two campaign, but probably a National League campaign, what sort of players will Hurst recruit? We talk about the fight and the aggression, but to me, it feels like he instills that and he puts that in his players, as opposed to deliberately going out and looking for players who embody that.
Yeah, I imagine he's the sort of manager that when he recruits players, probably uses character references a lot. And is more, over and above ability, he wants to see aggression in players, but he also wants good character references from other managers and people he respects in the game. And know that he's going to get the sort of non-negotiables that he expects from a player. That players who just kind of see the game in the way that he sees it, in the fact that you're in a battle with your direct rival on the pitch, and that you've got to be ready for those individual battles all over the pitch and get the basics right and do, and I think as long as he just looks for reliable players, and I think that's the problem he's had in his last few jobs, is he's been dropped and catapulted into jobs where he's not chosen the players, he's not done the recruitment. You go back to Ipswich job, he's gone in and he's tried to bomb out senior players because, who were controlling that dressing room when he walked through the door, because they're not the characters, the early vibes he's getting from his interactions with those players is, right, well, I don't think these players are going to run through brick walls for me, so they can go. And he's let everybody know that in plenty of time. And it's been the undoing of him. You can't just walk into a new dressing room and do that in this day and age. And, so that's cost him in his previous jobs. I think it was much the same at Scunthorpe. He never really got on top of the dressing room, because it was a dressing room he inherited, and he wanted to do a load of business in the January window. And I think Peter Swan just turned around and said, well, we're going a completely different way. So not only am I not giving you the money you want in January, I'll give you P45 as well. So, yeah, I think recruitment's a big thing for him, because he needs players on the same wavelength as him, who see the game in the same way and will deliver those non-negotiables.
So takeover dependent, and that is the big question mark. It's a huge one, really, for the future of the football club and, of course, Hurst. If they go down and Hurst gets a full season, do you see them coming straight back up? Because to me, he's done it before. He has the fight, and regardless of the mishmash of the squad, Mike, there's still quite a few good players in there.
Yeah, it's a tough question in the National League, because, you could say you take a relative League One team coming down into League Two and you've got 3 automatic spots for playoff places. And in the National League, you've got 1 automatic spot, is it? And then it's all they got the playoffs every year, I think, virtually, when Greaves in charge of Grimsby. They will make the playoffs next season. But, you know, to win the title's a big ask. So I guess like the Southend, Grimsby, whoever it is that goes down, they're going to have to run the gauntlet that, you know, the likes of Tranmere and, you know, Luton and teams like that have had to run in recent years of, yeah, okay, you can pretty much be sure if you managed well, you'll get into the playoffs, but that's only half the job. And then you've just got these massive games at the end of the season. I think it's really hard to come back and win the title at the first time of asking. So that's the position. Well, that's the position I thought Southend would have been in with Mark Mosley. Is they'd look pretty nailed on for a top 7 finish and a playoff campaign. And I think it's the same for Grimsby. Is playoffs at a minimum, I would suspect. Yeah.
Yeah, they probably will be top of the betting, I would imagine. But there's always a side in the National League that come out of nowhere, aren't there? And usually go up with the so-called bigger clubs, usually having to settle for the playoffs. So we'll keep an eye on Grimsby, and maybe they can do the unthinkable under Paul Hurst, but we'll wait and see.